Thank you so much, Joseph, and hi, everybody. I'm so excited to be here today to have this conversation. Thank you so much to the TBOT, as it's known in my notes, for everything you've done to put this lunch together. And thank you again for taking 2 hours or more out of your day to be here for this conversation. C'est un grand plaisir de vous voir, comme toujours. Je connais plusieurs de vous dans la salle aujourd'hui, and maybe I'll just begin by saying a special hello to Team Oakville, who bought a table, Mayor Burton and Nav Nanda, Councillor Nanda, and Councillor Chisholm, Councillor Tom Adams. Thank you so much for representing Team Oakville here today. Can't wait to get back home sometime. And see you there. And of course, my MP colleagues, Michael Koto, Karim Bardizi, and Chi Nguyen, who is here, and I think Ali Alsasi was trying to get here as well. Thanks, Team Ottawa, for coming to join this conversation. Councillor Sachs, thanks for taking the time. And I've got a few shout outs to my previous lawyer crowd. Michael Kelly is here. I articled with Michael Kelly. He's at OMERS now. Scott Val, McCarthy's, David Level from the McCarthy's table. Thank you so much, everyone, for being here. And certainly I remember my legal days fondly, especially when I'm reading legal agreements, and thankful for that education at the U of T and other institutions. So I thought I would begin by setting the table, as it were, talking a little bit about the Prime Minister's Davos speech. And I'm deciding I'm not going to read a speech today. I think people get pretty bored pretty fast from speech reading. And so I thought I would talk a little bit about the experiences that I have had as foreign minister since the Davos speech, but even before that, since my appointment last May. And in particular, what we have seen is that the world, foreign ministers, leaders, governments around the world are looking to Mark Carney's speech at Davos as a guiding light for their consideration of how their foreign policy will be formulated. Donc c'était un honneur d'être la ministre des Affaires étrangères à ce temps-là, d'entendre le discours, mais aussi de mettre en œuvre la politique nécessaire, to put into place the necessary policy that emanates from the speech. But before I speak about that speech and the implications of it, maybe I'll just take a step back and talk about May 2025 and the conversations I had with the Prime Minister at that time, and certainly before, because I was going to leave political life and go back to the university. That was the plan, and then I had a few conversations with the Prime Minister. He was not the Prime Minister then. This is back in January and February last year, and I said to him, I'm planning to leave, and I'm going to go back to teaching and research, which was my original true love professionally. And he said, I'd like you to run again. And I said, well, let's talk about what particular policies you are going to be enunciating if you are successful. And in particular, what do you think about trade diversification? Because as you know, trade diversification is very much a buzzword. Everyone is talking about diversifying our relationships. It kind of reminds me of when I was procuring the vaccines and we were talking about diversifying our vaccine portfolio, but you have to dig a little deeper to understand what trade diversification in this era means. And in particular, when we have been so reliant on our largest trading partner for so long, and I will say legitimately so, given that the President of the United States at that time did sign the CUSMA, and the dependence and interdependence was rational. It was a rational decision to be interdependent in the way that we are. And so what we discussed then early last year was very much trade diversification, growing non-US trade, doubling it over the next 10 years, ensuring that we built relationships with countries not only in our current orbit at the time, which would be G7 partners, for example, but also developing new relationships, new partnerships, and giving that meaning from an economic standpoint so that businesses and universities and not-for-profit organizations and individuals and their businesses, SMEs, could benefit from international relations. And so there began the conversation with Prime Minister Carney, as he was not then, about whether I would run again and how we would work together to diversify trade. And I will say that I'm really happy that I came back and that I'm able to do the work that we're doing together, our caucus, our government, our cabinet, and the broader business community to grow the Canadian economy in a distinct way now. There is a sense of urgency in the government. There is a sense of urgency in our country that we have no time to waste and that we need to work together and ensure that we are A, never the 51st state, and B, that we are able to rely on alliances and trading partners around the world, some of them traditional allies, some of them new trading partners. And so it's an exciting time to be in this role. It's also very demanding and very exciting to be able to be in those rooms where the conversations are happening. And I think that John Stackhouse and I will talk a little bit about that in the Q&A. So that brings us then to the Davos speech itself. And in that speech, the Prime Minister used a lot of complex terminology. And I like complex terminology, but it's not readily digestible for every average day conversation. So variable geometry, values-based realism, the multilateral rules-based order. These are terms that we don't often hear in everyday parlance. And so on the plane, on the way back home, I said, Prime Minister, we're going to have to implement this policy position that you've set out in Davos, and that's going to largely fall upon your ministers, and one of whom is the foreign minister. And so that's the work that we're doing every day, including in India. And as you know, I just got back a few hours ago. And I'll say that these terms, and I'll unpack them here for you now, and then I'll apply them to the case of India that helps us really understand what he meant in the Davos speech. And before I get to unpacking, I just have to say, when I was recently at the Munich Security Conference, in every room, people were talking about Prime Minister Carney's Davos speech. They were referring to it as the speech, the theory, the ideas, the hypothesis. I call it the Carney Doctrine, and it essentially boils down to ensuring that we see the world as it is, not as we wish it to be, that we understand that this is a moment in time where we need to uphold not only our long-held values, those relating to human rights and reconciliation and environmental sustainability, for example, but also that we adopt a pragmatic view that is necessary in this moment in time, especially when the global trading order is being completely rewired. And Prime Minister Carney used the word transformation in his speech. And he has a debate with President Alexander Stubb of Finland, who calls it more of a transition, if you will. But let's put that type of debate to the side and simply say, as I often do, that our foreign policy is now principles imbued with pragmatism. That we now need to say, how can we, from a foreign policy standpoint, grow the domestic economy? And so the two are linked now in a way that they have not traditionally been linked. Diplomacy today is not only about meeting new friends in far-off places. It is also about ensuring that our relationships around the world add value to domestic economic growth. And such is the reasoning, and now I'll turn to the application of the Carney Doctrine. Such is the reasoning behind our trip to India. The reasoning is that we can no longer afford to put a $4 trillion economy to one side while we aim to diversify our trading partners and grow the domestic economy, including in the educational sector. What we have to do, being realists, being pragmatists, is to say, yes, there are serious issues in the bilateral relationship with India, and we need to address those issues from a public safety and security standpoint. And we will do that through building a security dialogue at the highest levels with India. We will do that by ensuring that the rule of law allows a trial and a judicial process to unfold independent of political actors. We will do that through ensuring that we build our projet de loi, our legal initiatives in the government to address issues like extortion, issues like harassment online, and other areas that Michael knows so well and Kareem knows so well from working in the government with us. That's one track of the work. But being pragmatic in this moment, we say there's another track. And that other track is the domestic economy and ensuring that we are pushing on a number of competitive advantages that we hold as a country. And those were part of the negotiations that I undertook when I went to India last October. And I have a strategy. It's always dangerous to reveal your strategy to a room of 250 people, but I will do that anyway. My strategy is to try to get to countries before the Prime Minister does, not knowing his schedule and not discussing this strategy really with him. But I always think it's a good idea for me to go into these countries and lay the groundwork before he's going to go. And as I said, it's part of the tilling of the soil, if you will, to ensure that this is a good idea for us from a foreign policy perspective. And so it was that I went to India, the first kind of thawing of some of that diplomatic ice that had been so frozen for a couple of years. And in that visit, the foreign minister of India and I issued a joint statement. And the first page of that joint statement dealt with the track one that I've just described: public safety and security, respect for the rule of law. The second track of that joint statement consisted of those competitive advantages that we need to work from a Canadian perspective. We need to find the areas in the world where that is possible. So in that joint statement, we talk about AI and tech, agriculture, and the interdependent agricultural relationship in areas like dal, they call them peas, pulses. It's dal for us Indians. In energy and critical minerals, there is a hunger for Canadian energy and critical minerals, not just in India, around the world. Every room I am in, including when I was in India in October, and again, I'll put out the deliverables in a sec, you hear and I hear countries asking for a piece of this part of Canada. And so where's our energy minister? Never used to be an international minister. Now our energy minister plays on the international stage in these international agreements and simply is so in demand for that very reason. So we had critical minerals and energy, as well as small and medium-sized businesses and B2B work. And let us not forget the driver of the India-Canada relationship, which is people-to-people ties. And the fact that our country has at least 1.86 million people who come from the Indian subcontinent here, or whose families originated there. And the people-to-people ties run deeper, even in terms of students, 400,000 students from India all over Canada. And so these are areas that we encapsulated in our joint statement last October, tilling the soil for a potential leader-level visit. The leaders met in the G20 in South Africa, which I was not planning to go to until the Prime Minister walked up to me and said, like 5 days before, "You're coming to South Africa, right?" And it sounded like a question, but I don't think it was. And I said, "Yes, I'm coming." And so I went, and I'm really glad I went, even though, as we all have our stories about flights, so I won't tell you all my stories right now. But in South Africa, the leaders met and they agreed to a comprehensive economic partnership agreement negotiation. That was fundamental. Not an FTA, a comprehensive economic partnership agreement with a timeline of the end of 2026. And so there's a lot of work ahead to do in negotiating the CEPA, and they agreed again just 2 days ago to ensure that that gets done from a trade perspective. In addition, in South Africa, the invitation was made to Prime Minister Modi. Of course, he had been here to the G7 in June 2025 for Prime Minister Carney to visit in January or February, and so it was really amazing that this visit occurred. The deliverables run even more broadly than the CEPA itself. The Cameco deal was finalized, $2.6 billion for uranium in civil use in India. That's amazing. It's amazing not just for Cameco, it's amazing for Canada, it's amazing for Saskatchewan. Premier Moe was there. It's a real landmark agreement. 13 Canadian and Indian universities are coordinating on an education partnership at the post-secondary level, and Joe mentioned the education strategy. And I kept saying on that score, the federal government does need to play a role in our foreign affairs in terms of bringing educational links together. And so this is an example of that, the educational partnership and the strategy. Then we have an agreement between the Canadian Space Agency and the Indian Space Research Organization. We have an MOU on AI and technology, and in particular, building on the ACITI. That was an agreement reached between Prime Minister Modi, Prime Minister Albanese, and Prime Minister Carney on the sidelines of the G20. Literally, 3 leaders sat down in the holding room or the lunch room on the sidelines of their meetings and hammered out an agreement on a piece of paper together. Not their teams, just the leaders. And so this is a part of the negotiations now. What else can we add into an agreement that allows us to coordinate on tech and AI? And then we also have defense cooperation. And I was the Minister of National Defense when we put the Indo-Pacific strategy into place. We have our Asia-Pacific Foundation table right over here, so you'll remember that Indo-Pacific strategy, right, guys? And in that Indo-Pacific strategy, we did contemplate defense links. We contemplated port visits to India, but they didn't ever occur. So I said, let's get defense and security back on the agenda and see how we can build the defense relationship. There's going to be a defense dialogue between Canada and India going forward. So this is an example, if you will, of Canada putting into effect principled pragmatism, not letting go of the values that we have, the respect for the rule of law, the importance of law enforcement in the criminal code and public safety and security, as well as pushing on the economic levers that we need to internationally in order to ensure that we are contributing to domestic economic growth. And our government is also putting into place projects that are very attractive internationally. The 10 major projects legislation, for example, the work on defense and building the defense industrial strategy. $80 billion was committed in the last federal budget to defense. The Canadian Armed Forces, who definitely need more supports, and dual-use infrastructure, including ports, highways, and airports and runways. So you can see this is, in short, a moment of growth for Canada. It's a moment of growth domestically, it's a moment of growth internationally, and we are tying that together in our foreign policy. Trade diversification has yielded not only work with India, but 12 agreements over the last 6 months across 4 continents. This is the alacrity that we are moving with. Et c'est un privilège d'être là avec notre gouvernement à ce moment. Mais c'est très, très important d'avoir les gens comme vous, les entreprises, businesses, organizations that you represent, are the way in which we will allow this work on diversification to unfold. We are building the structure, the infrastructure, if you will, but we need you to exercise it. We need you to say, we know this is possible because there has been in place these agreements. Whether it is with India, whether it is with Indonesia, whether it is through the SAFE agreement that we have negotiated successfully as the only non-European country to join the European Defence Procurement System. These are all avenues for business. These are all avenues that we are working to put in place to provide more opportunity for you as businesses, but also for the broader Canadian economy, which will be good for workers, good for businesses, and good for our trade diversification success. Government cannot do it alone, in other words. The global order will not sustain itself. We need leaders who will act responsibly. And leaders come in many shapes and sizes. They come from many, many venues. And all of you in this room are in that category. We all have a role to contribute to Canada's prosperity. And then we have a role, after we build it, to protect it and to renew it through the choices that we will make together. We are engaging with the world. We are doing it leaning forward, with enthusiasm and excitement because we know Canada to be the greatest country on the face of the earth. Thank you.
Thank you, Minister. That's all the more impressive given your travel over the last short while. There's a lot we want to get through in the next 15 or so minutes, including the economic and business opportunities that are quite extraordinary. But we should touch first on the war, which is continuing in real time. As I understand it, the U.S. has wound down to an online presence. Its embassies in the region. I think we're probably doing the same. 100,000 Canadians, I believe, in the region. Probably most of you know people who are there. Our hearts are and thoughts are with all of those, as well as the people directly impacted by this conflict. I want to take you back to Friday night and when you got the call that the attack was underway, because in some ways it was the first big test of what you might call the Carney Doctrine, this idea of principles imbued with pragmatism. Okay, here we go. You're in Mumbai, I think, with the Prime Minister. Can you take us into the room and give us a sense of what you and the Prime Minister talked about in that moment?
So we weren't together at the time. And of course, he has a program that is sometimes separate from mine, and then sometimes we meet up in a particular event or meeting. And so we actually weren't together. It was the date of the university, and I was actually with the universities, and then he was with the universities. And so I was actually in a room with my deputy minister and some members of his team, and then he came in and we had the conversation about our approach. And in particular, I wouldn't say that it was the first test. I would say that we are continually calibrating and implementing the principles of, pragmatism, as well as how do we uphold Canadian values. And for example, I was in Greenland opening up the consulate in Nuuk, and that was an example of the Carney Doctrine, where we're standing for the principles of international cooperation, as well as Greenland's and Denmark's sovereignty, at the same time as trying to understand and execute on some economic relationships between Greenland and Denmark. So apart from that, though, so we're in the room and we have a serious conversation about our long-held view that Iran's nuclear proliferation is unacceptable and contrary to the international agreement that Canada and many other countries are signatories to on nuclear non-proliferation. We have, as a country, have for over 15 years not had diplomatic relations with Iran, given the state-sponsored terrorism that it executes, and certainly the human rights abuses against its people. And we have 18 months ago declared the IRGC as a terrorist entity. So we had a very strongly held view that was really in place last June during the 12-day war that has at its foundation that nuclear proliferation by Iran is unacceptable. At the same time, we want to make sure that we are standing for civilian lives and civilian infrastructure that is necessary to preserve those lives. And so our foreign policy on Iran has been very much focused on individuals. Sanctions that we've put in place, 500 of them, have been focused on individual well-being, and we've been very critical of the reprehensible abuse of human rights, including against women and girls. And so that is the kind of the heart of our foreign policy right now. And you said it, like our top priority right now is the 100,000 Canadians that are in the region. And I was on the phone with foreign ministers of Gulf countries and Middle East countries all weekend. This is in between the meetings, making sure that there are possibilities for Canadians to have supports in those countries, including Oman this morning, who they still have, or had at the time of my conversation with the foreign minister, have airspace that is still viable. And so I requested use of that airspace if necessary for Canadian citizens to get out. So there's many, many layers to our foreign policy vis-a-vis this war. And one of those layers involves the protection of civilians and the assistance to Canadian citizens themselves who are being advised to shelter in place.
With respect to the military engagement from the U.S. and Israel itself, though, the Prime Minister was pretty unequivocal. There's often nuanced ways to approach this, as you know. When I first heard his words, I thought, well, there's not a lot of daylight there to parse. And since then, you've heard a number of commentators say this doesn't square with the Davos speech. So help us understand better how you circle that square.
So there is a necessity to uphold our long-held view as a country that the Iranian regime, and certainly the proliferation of nuclear capacity, is unacceptable, including, in addition, the way that the Iranian regime, as a state sponsor of terrorism, has treated its population. The situation is fluid. Our understanding is, and was at the time, that the intention was to address that nuclear threat. And so, at the same time, we want a diplomatic resolution. We want to protect civilian infrastructure and civilian lives. And so we are very much of the mindset that nuclear proliferation is unacceptable, and death to civilian lives and infrastructure is also unacceptable. And certainly you've seen Iran responding against countries throughout the region: Qatar, UAE, Saudi Arabia, Jordan. And some of these countries have strong missile defense systems, and some of them have less strong defense system. And so the situation is very volatile and very real in terms of the potential for human life to be lost across the region. And that is our main concern always.
Very early hours here in this situation, but what can Canada bring to the table in terms of helping to resolve this?
The question is a good one, because we have a very specific reputation, well earned around the world, as a country that seeks to be an interlocutor, especially in times of tension and conflict. And so that is the point that I'm raising in my conversations with Gulf countries and the Middle East more broadly, to say we would like to play a role in the cessation of hostilities and the diplomatic resolution to the future result between these countries. It is a role that we are seeking to continually play, and our relationships around the world matter a great deal. And so even on the phone this morning with the Foreign Minister of Oman, he said, I appreciate your offer, and I will definitely ensure that we are in touch about further work that we can do together diplomatically, remembering that Oman was the host and played a part in the negotiations that broke off last week.
Let's shift to India, and maybe I can make it India and China, the two great rising economic powers of our time. It's extraordinary how quickly this government has moved with a reset with both countries. It's probably going to be more complicated than that. But what are the signals that you are bringing home, especially to business decision makers from both those markets, others as well, but those two in particular, in terms of what Canadian businesses need to be thinking about
So I'll take you back to the conversation that I referred to with Mark Carney running for office back in January and February last year. And I said to him, what do we need to do to ensure that we actually yield trade diversification? Because my view is, and we've been saying it as a government for some time, that we had significant trade agreements around the world. We were the only G7, we are the only G7 country that has a free trade agreement with every other G7 country. And it was true at the time we were having those conversations as well. So what is missing? Well, right here in this room, this is a very, very important message, is that we had the infrastructure in place from a trade perspective. We need it to be operationalized and utilized. And such is the case with the relationship with India, and we can talk about China, and we can talk about Mercosur and other regional trade arrangements. For example, we're seeking to finalize an FTA with ASEAN in 2026. This is the infrastructure of trade. We are in a moment where the global trading environment and network is being completely reordered. We need all of us to be utilizing the agreements that we are executing, or they will stand there and we will keep having to rely on one trading partner and all the difficulty that that has caused.
Can I push you a bit further on that? Because I've heard this conversation for decades. We need to diversify, and we're making progress over the years, but it's slow progress. What are we in business missing in the equation?
I think, and this is why I wanted to come and have this conversation right after getting off the plane, because I think it's really important to unpack what we are doing internationally so that it's understandable and useful to the business community and the broader Canadian public. And so for that to occur, I think you need to understand what we are doing internationally. You probably should be able to ask your questions so that we can make it accessible. That's what I'm trying to do, make foreign policy and these types of agreements that we are reaching accessible and understandable for businesses to utilize. That will yield actual trade diversification over and above the agreements that we're signing.
It's quite impressive, and I get to see this at RBC, how much global interest there is in Canada now. We're hearing from sovereign wealth funds, from multinationals, from influential people around the world saying we want to move billions, and they do underscore billions, into Canada. You're hearing this as well. And then they stress, but we're not waiting. You have to move this year on some stuff for us to make that portfolio allocation. Maybe give us a better sense of the time pressure here and what we're up against, because you're in rooms in Mumbai, but in lots of other places.
So I'm dealing with my own time pressures, John.
Yeah.
So I'll let you guys figure out yours. But building up to these types of trips, that's where the pressure is for me, because we have to make sure that there is a tangible result when we're utilizing taxpayer dollars. I've always been a large proponent of showing value for money, and this is part of what I'm kind of working towards when we're dealing with these time pressures and trips. But we do hope that the CUSMA will be reviewed this year. We are dealing with 85% of our goods are still traversing the border tariff-free. It's on the sectoral tariffs, on the steel, on the aluminum, on the auto sector, on lumber, that we would like to have some movement, obviously. And so that's really where I feel, as a country, the pressure is resting, is on those sectoral tariffs. But again, the CUSMA is relatively favorable, and I mean relative to other countries' experiences.
Yes, we're still kind of have a competitive advantage there, which may not feel great in the moment, but it's less painful than a whole lot of other places have it. Speaking of time pressures, the countdown clock is at 0.
Guys, the light is blinking.
It is
red,
blinking
red,
furious.
Yes.
But
Can we take a couple from the audience?
yes, let me see what has come in, because I've got my
I have some of my
iPad
past students in the audience, so they know
They all
that I
have
like
better
questions.
questions.
Right, Chad? Yeah.
So we have.
There's a question right there.
Yeah, the new era of partnership in terms of Canada and India, quoting the Prime Minister. How confident are you that the new era won't be derailed anymore? We've seen restarts in the past. How is this time different?
So I'm always struck, I didn't know the Prime Minister too well before I decided to run again and all that. I had been a visiting scholar at the Bank of Canada when he was governor. It wasn't like he was coming to get my deep insights into securities law at the time, but I'll say that I'm pretty impressed with his decisiveness and the way in which we are moving very quickly. Looking at my MP colleagues here, because I think we all see that there's a definite path that we are on, and I do not imagine that we will be derailed, period. And you've seen members of the opposition party cross the floor. Perhaps they see that as well.
Another good question here on SMEs and what competitive advantages do you think SMEs should build upon for longer term and successful diversification, and what is the government doing differently now to ensure their success?
Well, first of all, having taught securities and corporate law for so many years, we know that SMEs occupy 97% of our capital markets. And this is an incredible number that we in the government have to digest, that we're not just talking about the top companies listed on the TSX or what have you. So I think this is very much about SMEs, the work we're doing. And in fact, when I talk about people-to-people ties, I really believe that includes SMEs as well. Those companies are largely family-run businesses that are seeking to be able to sell their products or purchase products from India, for example, or any of the other jurisdictions I've mentioned. This is a framework that we need to bring home so that the SMEs can take advantage of the work we're doing internationally. So trade shows, super important. Trade missions. Minister Sidhu is constantly going on trade missions. Those are very important so that Canadian businesses can market their goods in foreign jurisdictions. And so if you want to participate in a trade mission, you can contact his office or my office or your MP, and your member of parliament should be able to connect you to those trade missions.
Those are great pointers, and we shouldn't lose sight of the good infrastructure that has been built over many years. Think of the Trade Accelerator that many in this room and the Board of Trade built. We've been privileged to be part of it at RBC. It's hugely helpful for our clients. We've seen them take advantage of it and profit quite well from it. So we do have tools out there and need to keep adding to it. Minister, the blinking light seems to be blinking brighter and faster.
So red.
Mindful of your
Hard
schedule.
on the eyes after a flight.
I wonder if you could just wrap up with a positive reflection from your trip, and if there was any one point that really gave you confidence, especially for businesses, in terms of what we can do with respect to India, but more broadly to all the wonderful markets out there that we can work with more and more in the future.
I think that there is a positive story here. Despite the very difficult economic environment that we find ourselves in, despite global conflict that is extremely disconcerting and stressful, Canada is on a positive path to growth. Canada has everything the world wants. There is not a room that I go into where people are are uninterested in Canada. On the contrary, energy superpower, critical minerals, leader in AI and tech, agricultural products that the world wants. And the Prime Minister has said something on agriculture I think I just have to mention, which is that we will never, as a country, we will never weaponize food. We will not weaponize the food supply chain. We will not use food as a tool of aggression. That is not the Canadian way. We want to partner in a professional manner and trade in accordance with principles that the trading infrastructure of our world is built upon. So these are the types of positive messages that I'm not only receiving but delivering internationally. And I want to thank all of you for the work that you do individually to help our country grow and help our country survive, so that, as I said, we continue to be the greatest country on the face of this planet.
Well said, Minister, and what a great illustration of principles imbued with pragmatism, what you just said about agri-food, and there's many, many more. But thank you for your leadership, for your service, and your determination to take Canada forward.
That's right. Thank you. Thank you so much. Thank you so much.